Hello, everyone, and welcome to our November installation of Safe Space for White Questions. For those of you who've not joined us for previous sessions, I'll just give you a little bit about kind of what this is and how we roll. I'll start first by acknowledging that at least Alex and I, who you'll be hearing from throughout this event, are based in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And this obviously informs really fundamentally, basically all of the work that we do, and working through those kinds of complications related to sovereignty, related to identity, related to citizenship, and what it means to be here as migrants in Mi'kma'ki as opposed to, or arrivals in Mi'kma'ki as opposed to just thinking about our relationships as citizens of Canada is really important to this kind of work. So what we do here is pretty straightforward. We take your questions about racial justice, about kind of anything around this idea of building racial resilience, questions, struggles that you've had, and it's meant to be a space where you can ask essentially any well-intentioned question. And I'm just gonna pass it around so you can see who you're dealing with here, the whole production team. I never actually said who I was, apologies. I'm Ajay Parasaram. I'm an assistant professor in the departments of International Development Studies and History and cross-appointed to political science, all here at Dalhousie University. And then I'm gonna pass it over to my colleague, Alex.
Hello, folks. Thanks, AJ, for that intro, and thanks to you all for being here today. Just quick intro to me. I'm Alex Kasnabish. I am a professor in sociology and anthropology at Mount St. Vincent University, and you'll be hearing from me periodically through this event too. Now over to our production team.
Hello, everyone. My name is Courtney Law, and I'm a white settler here on the East Coast. I'm a research assistant for Professor Parasaram, and I will be moderating the Q&A. I look forward to hearing another valuable conversation on this important topic, and I'm going to pass this on to our other behind-the-scenes helper, Liam.
Hi, everybody. I'm Liam. I am the feed producer for this event. I am a many generations white settler in Mi'kma'ki, and just as in the prior events, I'm really looking forward to the discussions and many interesting questions that are going to arise. And now I'm going to throw back over to Ajay.
All right, so we are back and we have our first question, which is, I'll just read it out loud. Does using the term safe space appropriate a valuable concept used by people of color and apply it to white people who, by virtue of structural privilege, do not need a safe space? This is a really important question, I think, and it kind of gets right to the heart of, well, certainly the name that we have for this event. I'll speak to this first and then I'll pass it over to Alex, and that's kind of how we generally progress. So coming out of the research that I've done on this subject, I would just say that if the conventional approaches to dealing with building racial resilience and dismantling racism had worked, then we wouldn't be in the situation where, a space like this were necessary. And in a lot of the work that I've done to date on this, one of the things that motivated my thinking was the fact that, for 40, 50 years, even longer, at least for 100 years, racialized scholars and others have kind of been proving that there is systematic and structural white supremacy. They've shown how it works. And then while it's been decided in the kind of intellectual sphere, it has not really in substantive ways permeated society writ large. We don't live in a society free from racial structural violence. So this is in a way an experiment to see, well, what if we just create this space where we can talk about these things with an explicit objective of helping to build confidence, right? So basically, in a way, what we're doing is we're taking fragility at face value and saying, you know, if you say that you experience racial fragility, we believe you because you say it, and we want to provide you with tools to build racial resilience. So certainly it does borrow, and in some ways, and I know Alex will probably, he has a lot to say on the subject, so I'll leave that for Alex to talk about, but it certainly borrows from this idea of safe space, and it's not our intent to take anything away from racialized communities. And I'm going to pass it over to Alex to explain his piece on this.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. It's a very fair question, I think. Part of the context here, it's worth noting, is that while the space that we try to curate here is meant to be like an open, inclusive, and even somewhat introductory space into which people can feel free to enter without any pre-existing knowledge of these struggles or the work we're trying to do here in terms of cultivating the capacity for collective liberation. But the term itself, as AJ's pointed to, has its own history and a lot of history, and as some of you probably would recognize, it has not only a history that is kind of inclusive and meant to support people by creating spaces on campuses or in community that people who are part of oppressed and otherwise marginalized groups can feel free to go to and to be amongst other folks like them without being amongst people who might seem more or be their oppressors. It's also been kind of a target by this sustained campaign by the far right and the modern alt-right to sort of, constantly like poke fun at, undermine, dehumanize these groups yet again, right? So we get this language of safe space that kind of like critiques it and suggests that it's somehow preferential or special treatment, or that we're all snowflakes who need this special protected environment to retreat from the world from. So we wanted to use it in our own events here, in part because we think that it highlights the fact that white identified people kind of enjoy mainstream society as their safe space. But ironically, as a result of that, as a result of sort of being figured as the dominant powerful group in that society, they're left weirdly vulnerable and unable to actually ask questions about their own racialized identity, their own weirdly like centered and yet invisible status in that hierarchy of power, and to ask really hard questions about like how they could live different, more human, more liberated lives. So like, we're not trying to take the piss out of the title. We're actually serious when we say we think white identified people need safe spaces to de-radicalize it, to be weaned away from the toxic relations that dominant groups in society get fed on, and that taint our subjectivity, right? So I was, for a long time, for example, also a part of a radical men's group where we would come together to talk about issues. It was, a group that was only open to male identified people. We didn't call it a safe space group, but you could have called it that. And that wasn't because any individual man in that group was oppressed in our society. As men, none of us are. We all enjoy like the patriarchal privilege, even if we want to disavow it. But it was still worth having a space where we could come together and actually support one another in doing some of that, pro-feminist, de-radicalizing work that didn't mean that we were somehow the victims, but rather that we required a space that didn't impose our journey on women, typically, women identified people who are often asked to do that work of care and support, and also that allowed us to identify that important work to begin with. So it's in that spirit that we've borrowed that language for our event, our initiative here too. Yeah, and it's certainly not to suggest that there aren't there aren't concerns or legitimate critiques that can and have been raised about our use of terminology. But I do think, just to finish up my point here, that the things that AJ pointed to are super important for us to keep in mind, that this comes out of a tradition, much like the language of intersectionality, comes out of a radical woman of color feminism that actually was always about seeing struggles as interconnected and not about parceling ourselves out into narrow, like, identity-based categories. That consciousness raising was an important struggle for all groups of people. It didn't mean everybody was responsible for everybody else's journey, but it meant that, like, collective liberation is a sustained collective process. And so, yeah, we unironically want to invite white identified people to join us in this process. I'll pass it back to you, AJ.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. And I see we actually have our second question is a bit of a follow-up on that, which I think you kind of addressed here, which doesn't safe space also originate in feminist and queer struggles? I would say yes, like, it's not my area of research expertise or anything, but that certainly is the first context within which I hear about it. And I think that in some ways shows the utility of the idea. Certainly, like, as feminists and queer activists and women of color, etc., have kind of carved out that space. As I understand it, what they were seeking was a reprieve from always having to perform, always having to, whether it's the patriarchy, whether it's the racism, what have you. And there's value then, but so that's not the part I would say that we want to borrow from, because indeed white people don't need that space. But the other side of the safe space is for people who share certain kinds of solidarity, whether they be good or whether they be bad. I think Alex's example of, like, this men's group is a great example, because in that group everybody benefits from patriarchy. But when you bring people who have those similar experiences, whether it's structural privilege or structural disadvantage, it allows you to cultivate certain kinds of responses and communications and deepen kind of levels of understanding that you wouldn't be able to do in a kind of fully mixed environment. And, as Alex said, this is what we're doing here is very much a kind of imperfect application of that. And we're okay with that because we're looking to make it useful. So I don't know if you'd like to say anything further on that follow-up question. Alex, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. I'll just maybe try to be brief on this one and just say, I mean, once again, I couldn't agree more. I think, to come back to the point that you started off your response to the previous question on, that this is where I think it's worth, like, being it's worth being willing to take risks in these areas, because if, like, as AJ's already said, if our prevailing strategies on anti-racist work and de-radicalizing white people or any dominant group in a given society were the only things we needed, we would have already achieved that end. And I think right now we're at a moment in history where it's kind of I think people are still struggling with this. It's incredible in certain ways. I say that, like, in a profoundly negative way, not in a laudatory way, that we are seeing the resurgence of forms of fascism and far-right activity and racist thinking promoted in some very mainstream, supposedly upstanding venues and amongst groups of people that, in a post-World War II context, I think our parents' generation would have been hard-pressed to imagine in some ways, quite frankly. The resurgence of those particular expressions. And so, I mean, I think in this moment, like, we can't not take chances with this. And while we certainly don't want to, like, it's never our intention to denigrate or try to be flippant with other people's struggles for social justice, I think it's also worth identifying the fact that, to quote Dr. Parasaram, one does not transport a porcelain vase in checked luggage. So, white identified people in a white supremacist society are not, as a result of their whiteness, up against the cutting edges of this system. That doesn't mean they don't suffer. That doesn't mean their lives aren't hard. That doesn't mean they don't have weird questions or strange concerns that they may not feel they can ask. in more inclusive, diverse venues, at the risk of being perhaps quite rightly identified as being tainted by white supremacy, but also, it's work that other people shouldn't necessarily be asked to do for them on their behalf, but it's necessary work. And so I think, in the tradition of going to the grassroots and trying to sustain popular education in pursuit of collective liberation, I think that's where we come in here, and I think that's why it's useful. It's also worth remembering that every revolutionary struggle is about the recovery of humanity. And what we want to do here is to also help, white folks, white identified people recover their humanity and recognize themselves amongst a diverse human community. And I think that does require a certain amount of safe space to do that. Back to you, AJ.
Thanks for that, Alex. And thanks again for the question. So the next question in the queue here is, what kinds of strategies can reduce racialization? So this one, I don't know if the person, they're posed as anonymous, so they're probably not, it'll be difficult to tell if they're the same because most questions here are anonymous, but I don't fully understand the question. So I'm going to interpret it in the way that I think it's intended. So the way I would see this is, racialization is a thing that happens. It's a process of racializing a human being and kind of inventing a kind of racial differentiation or taxonomy, if you will, to kind of borrow from the origins of the development of race science, which was this idea, of course, that the human race could be differentiated, hierarchically organized, et cetera, which we know to be not true. It has no scientific basis. There's only one human race. So in the quote and unquote real world, we know, of course, there is no race. But racialization speaks to this sociological phenomena of how people are constructed in ways that serve the interest of structural privilege. So that might be structural white supremacy in an explicit way in Canada or the United States or other settler colonies. It might take the form, that same kind of structural white supremacy might take a different form in a place like India, whether that be through shadism, whether that be through upper caste domination of Indian society. So it manifests. So in terms of how do we reduce racialization, I feel like until we deal with the root of racial problem, which is, white supremacy, structural white supremacy, that has its deep kind of modern roots, I would argue, it goes all the way back to the 1490s, but I think its contemporary acceleration and manifestation is a project of the 19th century. The rise of race science, the rise of the kind of international regime of states. So until we deal with those roots, racialization is actually something that is useful in some sense, because even though we know that it's not real in reality, we are acknowledging that it's happening sociologically, and things that have sociological significance are materially significant. But let me pass it over to my anthropologist friend here to say more about this. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, AJ. Yeah, that was, I think that was really well explained. And I don't want to belabor this point, but I think it's worth centering ourselves on and kind of living with, because I think people do struggle with this. The things that you have been told about race and the existence of distinct human races are wrong, and they are fictions, and they are made up, and they have no basis in scientific reality or consensus. The American Association of Human Geneticists, the largest association of human geneticists on the planet, a couple of years ago had to release a policy statement saying that they disavowed all use of modern genetic science to support theories of racial supremacy, because they were so horrified by the way that these things were being picked up and misinterpreted in the popular press, and by radical supremacists too, of course. So, because people balk at this, it seems common sense. But if I were to tell you that we were going to stop tomorrow to dividing people up according to the color of their skin, and instead we were going to use whether your earwax was wet or dry, as gross as that is no less genetically determined than the melanin content in your skin, or whether your earlobes are attached or unattached. right? Or like divide people into categories of height, right? So instead of skin color coded races, we have everybody who's above, 5.5 feet is one race, and everybody below is, and I mean, none of these things are any less arbitrary. Your skin color is an incredibly changeable feature of your genetic code, right? We all have genes that code for skin color and melanin content, but the darkness of your skin is environmental, and it depends on where your ancestors have come from recently and where you live now, and can change over time. So these kinds of things, I just think, like, this is often the work I do in class, in my intro classes, especially because this poisonous drink that we have been fed around the reality of race, which could not be more fictional, is a potent way of dividing people in order to convince us that some people have less of a right to live good and decent lives than other people by virtue of some arbitrary feature of their skin, which is then, of course, translated into their belonging in the human community. And today, clever racists don't speak that language anymore. So dum-dums in the Quillette, for example, who write for the Quillette and other alt-right trash outlets, will try and convince you that phrenology, okay, and if you don't know, phrenology was the, I'm not even going to call it a pseudoscience. That's like, that elevates it too much. It was the mystical wish fulfillment of super racist, poorly educated, white supremacist European males at the turn of the 20th century, who wanted to believe that they could justify the incredible violence of colonialism and the degradation and exploitation of other human groups by measuring the shape of their skull, and then correlating that with intelligence levels, which of course they weren't measuring, they were just assuming, right? So, oh, well, black people's skulls are this shape. This must mean that lack of intelligence is associated with the skull of black people, right? And obviously, like, whether a white person's skull was smaller or bigger or misshapen, it didn't matter. Whatever the shape of a white person's skull was, denoted progress, denoted intelligence, denoted civilization. I think, when I tell you that story, you can hear how phony it is. Well, that motivated, race science moving into the 20th century, was the basis for eugenics, was the basis for both, the incredible violence unleashed by the Nazis in their own murderous program, but also by eugenicists and by so-called race realists. And today, many racists are cleverer than that and no longer speak in terms of absolute scientific difference between races, but instead we'll talk about ethnicity and cultural difference, using the same categories, of course, of inequality, but this time expressed in culturalist tones. So it's like the Proud Boys stuff. If you've heard of the Proud Boys, you hear they say, we're not white supremacists, we're Western chauvinists, which of course is a really convenient way of doing an end run around the fact that race science has been so thoroughly delegitimized. But of course, these arguments over cultural superiority still remain very much in play, right? So, like, for example, well, I won't even, you don't need another tangent from me. Anyway, this is all to say that strategies to reduce racialization will be doomed to fail unless, as we come back to AJ's point, we address the fundamental work that notions of racial inequality exist to do. And what they exist to do is to convince you that certain groups of humans really aren't either human or aren't worthy of the kinds of things that we all know and believe we should enjoy. Dignity, democracy, autonomy, security of our persons, the ability to live a meaningful and all these kinds of like basic things that you would imagine for you and your family and your loved ones. Racism exists and theories of racialization exist to convince you that that's not true for everybody, that some people deserve to suffer and die in ways that are completely hidden from you, and that that's okay. Well, the fact is that's obviously not okay. We live in a world that demonstrates every day why that's not okay. And for us to address that, I think, is to address the fact that relations of exploitation and relations of oppression are intimately interwoven. So if you want to crack that nut, you have to imagine how we can live in this world together without imagining we need to eat each other up in order to do it, which I actually don't think is that hard a struggle, but it's amazing how the so-called race realists have worked so hard to convince us otherwise. Anyway, back to you, AJ.
All right, thanks for that. So next in the queue, and we've got a lot in the queue, so that's great. Please keep them coming. As a white person who wants to listen and learn and desires to be an ally, I have struggled using the quote-unquote wrong words in discussions without meaning to. This has created a lot of fear in me, and I'm finding that I'm not speaking up as much since I'm worried about saying something the wrong way. There are so many challenges, history, perspectives, and a whole language around these topics. We need to be able to speak with each other with compassion and patience when someone stumbles in order to learn and build community awareness. Thank you for creating the space. Well, that's great. I'm gonna interpret that as a comment, and thank you for that comment. I'm glad that this is useful, and we'll just move on then. Alex, just give me a wave. I know if you're happy to move on or if you'd like to say something. Okay, yeah, great. So thanks for that. The next question in the queue here is, I am a mixed person, white mixed with another race. Those of us who are mixed negotiate and occupy a complicated space. Do you have any thoughts on how to best leverage and mobilize this space within our own anti-racist work? That is a really good question. And as a person that is not quote and unquote mixed race, I'm very, very much South Asian. I'm actually going to put Alex on the spot here because I know he's mixed race, and I'm just not even going to answer this question. I'm going to pass this over to Alex to speak to this one.
Yeah, thanks, AJ. This is it's a great question, and I frankly think about it a lot and struggle with it too. So I mean, depending upon the day of the week and my mood, I refer to myself as an ambiguously racialized person, or a mixed race person, or a person of mixed background, whatever, depending upon the company I'm in and how provocative I want to be, I suppose. But I certainly identify as somebody who's people have come from very different parts of the world, and it came together to produce me and my sister. I think this is difficult because for me, as somebody who, I don't know, like, it's not hard for me to pass as sort of a swarthy white person in most contexts in this society, unless it's like I've been outside for a lot. It's summertime. And then different times of year as a result of my mixed genetic makeup, I can look really dark, and then it's more obvious. But then I open my mouth and I sound like a slow talking Southern Ontarian, and I have all the cultural coordinates of essentially as a person who is raised in like predominantly white community in Southern Ontario. So sometimes, to be honest with you, I feel like a bit of a phony even claiming any kind of mixed racialized identity. Maybe you feel the same way. I think we like. There's this whole, academia, critical social science for a long time was obsessed with this idea of like those people who existed on the margins, like liminal positions, right, where you cross borders, and they're often regarded as kind of dangerous or potentially productive sites to be. But I struggle with it, to be honest, and I tend to default in anti-racist spaces to feeling or to identifying myself more as a white passing person than I do a person who can, who has experienced the kind of racial violence that many much more obviously racialized people encounter. Now, I don't want to dismiss that. I've had some really weird and kind of shocking encounters, especially in the Canadian context, where people have told me to go back to where I'm from, or asked me like, I wouldn't, or said stuff like, I wouldn't do that in your country. I'm like, what country are you talking about? Like downtown Toronto, where I was raised? Like these weird jarring moments where you're reminded that you don't actually fit into the topology of white people. But for the most part, like, I'm not the kind of person who will generally get stopped arbitrarily by cops on the streets. I'm not in general a person who has to fear being openly identified by white supremacists as a target, although that's ambiguous, and I do think about that more. I think about that for my kids more in our current moment than I used to. So, I mean, I think this has to be treated like most of the things we talk about in this in our sessions, with honesty. So I'm happy to identify myself in the way that I feel is real and true to me, to other people, but I don't expect that I get some sort of like special entry to spaces where more obviously racialized people come together to talk about their experiences with white supremacy. I cannot assume that my limited experiences with racial violence are in any way like a microcosm or generalizable to people who have to live with it in a much more apparent way every day, because of those slippery scales of like belonging and racial boundary keeping that our society has instituted around skin color, and the kind of obsession or the correlation between skin color and these ideas around race. So I think it's useful. It's useful in part because we can breach the other way too, right? And finding ourselves in fairly white identified spaces where our difference isn't as obvious, we can be obviously useful, like monkey wrenches in the gears of the operation of those places, to trouble them, to remind people that, like I often find this at my workplace, right? I work in a place that's overwhelmingly white. Most universities are. My colleagues, wonderful people as the vast majority of them are overwhelmingly white. And there are times when we're having conversations, it's as if, race isn't in the room. And first of all, I like to remind them, race is still in the room. You're still white identified people. White isn't somehow nothing. White is most definitely a constructed race, or an idea around race. And hey, I'm also a person who splits this difference, right? Who's both like racialized, of course, but also white and not, right? And so let's think about the ways, like in so many of these spaces, we cross those boundaries. We mix these identities, and that's always present for all of us. But I guess I would say, and as my kind of rambling response is giving you a sense of a struggle with an easy answer to this, I would say the only place that I think it's worthwhile to begin with is the recognition of who we are authentically, right? Who you feel yourself to be. So being honest about your history and your people, locating ourselves. I mean, the more work we do this way, the richer it all becomes. Because it's like I point out to my, white friends, allies, colleagues, whoever. I'm like, you're not just white. Like, my mom isn't just like generic white. She's a white person who came from a country called Latvia on the shores of the Baltic Sea. For her, that actually means a very specific kind of, like, not just whiteness, but it comes with a cultural lineage and even like a unique position vis-a-vis other white people in the region, given that Latvia has kind of been overrun by successive waves of other colonizing whites. So remembering those histories is useful too, not as a way of saying, oh, Latvians are oppressed, just like, any other racialized group. No, because they're also privileged in particular kinds of ways, right? But in locating ourselves, we start to do the work of making sense of these relations of oppression. I think that's super worthy. So I'll leave it at there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that, Alex. A lot to think about there. I guess the only other thing I would want to add to that, as a less ambiguously racialized person, is to, as Alex was just saying, think about this oftentimes in terms of how you're grounded, where you're grounded, and think about the politics being to some extent issue based. And this is something that I would do as well, right? So when the conversation is explicitly about, indigenous sovereignty or something, I'm going to get out of the way and I'm going to, listen to what indigenous people have to say on the subject. Or, if the issue is more relevant to, Black people, then I want to hear what Black people have to say. And one kind of example of that is, we have a Black Faculty Association here at Dalhousie, really important project. And, like in the past, it's kind of come up a couple of times because there's lots of us who are racialized faculty members at Dal, but we're not Black in that sense. And there's been conversations about, well, should we join up with the Black Faculty Association? Should we form our own? and not in any systemic way, but I've always resisted this on the basis that, and I've discussed it with some of my Black colleagues who agree, that the issue is that their specific experience in this case is different. So they need a particular lobbying group in ways that I don't as a South Asian man, you know what I mean? So I don't want to take resources away from that group, nor do I want to pull them in a direction that is not a direction that is necessary for them to take. The issues are different, right? Just like the issues are different for mixed race people. And it doesn't mean that you can't be engaged in the work. In fact, it oftentimes means that you are particularly well positioned to do so. So the next question that we have here is, to what extent should we be softening language around racial injustice in order to reach white people who are in denial about racism? How do I convey the urgency of dismantling white supremacy while making sure the message is received by as many people as possible? That's a really good question, you know, like softening the question. I would say, rather than softening, think about alternative ways to help them understand, right? I would say don't soften the message. The people need to understand the urgency, but even more than they need to understand the urgency, they need to be in a frame of mind to understand what you're saying. And this is something I think we deal with in classrooms all the time, is because, you know, we can explain stuff to the captive audiences that we have in our classrooms, or the virtual classrooms nowadays. But if they're just sitting there because they need to be, it's not making an impact on them. So try to find different ways to explain things that can help them understand. So that might be a lateral move. That might be, it's usually the form of a lateral move, trying to tie it to another intersection of oppression that maybe they can understand, right? So, you know, if you're talking to a woman, for example, maybe try and make a connection with patriarchy. If you're talking to a particularly, you know, if you're talking to like a MAGA woman or something like that, maybe don't talk about intersectionality at all, but maybe talk about, you know, the shitty experience that she might have had, you know, at some point. Have her volunteer that information and then help her to work through the intersections. You don't need to use the language, you know what I mean? The language, the concepts are more important than the language, in my opinion, especially when you're find yourself in a situation where you're in almost like a no-win situation, like how I'm reading your question here. So because of the urgency of dismantling white supremacy, if it means you need to find a new vocabulary, stretch yourself to find that new vocabulary. And yeah, I'll pass it over to Alex to comment on that.
Yeah, a very good question here for sure, and I would echo all AJ's points. I guess I would say this is you know, just to point out, this is a tricky line to walk, because as with any like oppressive relationship, what the fact is that many people who benefit from living in a white supremacist society as white identified people don't feel like their lives are happy or easy or good, and they feel that legitimately. So when they are told they are part of an empowered and privileged group, when they are told that they exist as oppressors, as a group in relation to other humans, that totally gets many of their backs up. It engenders defensiveness, and it gets them to shut down in many cases. Now, that doesn't mean that that's not an important strategy to take sometimes. Like, sometimes we have to be really clear that when you're confronting like avowed racists and people who are kind of naked in their defense of like brutal hierarchies and oppressive relations. You know, you got somebody we've all had these people in our lives who are like, oh, it doesn't matter. The boss is always right. If the boss is paying you money, you should just be grateful. Like, you know, take a step back for a second and think about it. Like, we all know, even if you're an owner of capital, I suspect nobody watching this right now is, but let's say you own a factory somewhere, you know, that it's a bad and wrong thing to treat people like garbage and to use them as if they are disposable tools, right? Nobody actually is arguing that from a good faith position. They're arguing that because they're saying, no, here, I have the power to do this. I feel it's my entitlement. I've been weaned on this. And sometimes that just needs to be called out. You should be like, well, you should be less racist than I would suggest. Otherwise, you're going to get your ass handed to you one of these days. But if people are genuinely struggling, right? And this is, like I have family who are like this for sure, who want to understand, but because of a, very complex set of issues, like struggle to bring themselves to come to terms with the way that these sorts of structures of entitlement and privilege and violence work, then absolutely, it's important to sort of like abandon the activist language, especially, and not to browbeat them with it, but to find points of entry where you can get them to recognize common points that we can begin to have a discussion on. One of the points I think that many popular educators are making right now that I think is so worthwhile is that part of what social media has done so much to promote, but also the far right has been really good at doing. We've just seen it in the last US election, is this proliferation of disinformation, so that we don't even have common points that we can sort of begin agree, like a conversation about. It's like we can't even agree on what's going on in society, let alone what to do about it. And I think one of the things as anti-racist educators we have to be willing to do is to bring it back to some common points to move from. So what does your reality look like? What do you struggle with? What makes you feel like you're living a less than human existence? Why do you think, you blame indigenous people, for example, for like not having a good livelihood if you're a fisher on the South Shore of Nova Scotia right now? Like, tell me about your reality, right? Tell me about what you struggle with. And using that as a point of entry, but also being careful not to do the thing that happens to so many people who find themselves in positions of privilege in structurally violent societies, which is like what happened with so many men's groups, right? Which is that it's centered masculinity and centered, woe is me. As a man, I'm damaged by patriarchy. Yeah, absolutely I am, for sure. I'm cut off from all kinds of like aspects of my human existence. It makes me less fulfilled, less able to experience the range of human emotion and possibility, all this kind of stuff. But I cannot pretend in a patriarchal society that I deal with the kind of violence that's leveled at women identified folks, and the costs they bear in this particular society. Like, that's not equivalent, okay? My existential crisis is not the same thing as their actual experience of violence, dispossession, and dehumanization. So don't make it a narcissistic conversation about whiteness, about how hard it is to be white and male at this moment in history. If you want to hear that narrative, you can turn on any sitcom on mainstream TV right now and get this narrative that, oh, isn't it a hard thing, to be a white guy. It's like every stand-up comedian doing a bit on how like freedom of speech is the most important thing right now, right? Mm-hmm. It's just, it ends up sounding really phony and self-centering. So instead, I think finding those points of common agreement, of drawing out of folks those moments where they can recognize that they were once subject to the operation of some powerful interest or group that they could do nothing about simply by virtue of the way that they were understood in that society, and getting them to make those connections. Because it's true. I think one of the things about living in a deeply oppressive society is that we get cut off from being able to understand our common human existence. So other groups or people become like obstacles or instruments rather than actually existing diverse people. And that's what we're trying to get at, right? Back to you, AJ.
All right, thanks for that. So the next question we've got is, hi there, thanks for hosting this. I am a white identifying female working in international development in senior management positions with a long history of running gender, social inclusion, human rights programs in the Global South, as well as in Canada. I am reflecting on what kind of work I can meaningfully and legitimately do, as I am feeling increasingly uncomfortable about how I can, quote, give space, be an ally, unquote, to Southern-based non-white colleagues, while benefiting from an industry that in many ways continues to perpetuate inequalities. In addition, one thing I grapple with in my day-to-day are the intersections of race and gender in senior management levels. In this space, I am increasingly worried about highlighting gender-related issues for fear of it being perceived as racist. So thanks for that question. There's a lot in that question, I think. So at one level, there's the whole process of international development as an industry, the way that it's become. And I think certainly if you've been working in international development studies, I don't need to belabor you with the whole history of development and its problematic nature. So you clearly have that sorted. I think the essence of the question here, to some extent, gets to thinking about diversities of perspective that are informed from lived realities. So intersectionality to some extent, right? So it should be like, as you're, especially at this echelon in your career that you're in, which sounds like a very senior position, it makes sense that the higher up you go, the less and less diverse your colleagues are going to be. And the more inclined your colleagues, and I'm assuming here we're talking about predominantly relatively wealthy white males, who are probably also very intelligent people, may get increasingly savvy about thinking of ways to cut down your arguments. You know what I mean? So in this space, if you're feeling that you might be cut down for talking about, I think, very transparent gender inequalities that are structural in nature, it's probably because that is one of the tactics that your colleagues, whether consciously or unconsciously, are wielding to keep you quiet on that issue. So the way to respond to that, in my opinion, is to build horizontal alliances. So to recognize and put into practice that actually there is no difference here. Like, I mean, there are differences, of course, but you don't have to choose, because women are also racialized women, and the people, if you're looking to increase diversity at the level of senior management, which everybody should be doing, it has to be about people's diverse experiences and diverse perspectives. And what that means sometimes is changing the expectations about what is and is not qualified. Right? So what is it, think about your organizations, what is it that you're looking for when you say diversity? Because if what you're looking for is different skin tone or different like sexual practices, then you actually have no interest in diversity. What you have is an interest in people who can think like you and look differently, to check a box. It's one of the reasons why I'm incredibly dissatisfied, to put it politely, with the idea of self-identification that can take the form of a check mark or something, like, are you racially visible? Are you indigenous? Check. Are you black? Tell me about your experience, tell me how this lived experience informs the way that you're going to think. I want to know, if I'm hiring or looking for people in senior management levels, how does your experience translate into you wanting to do things differently from everybody else? Because otherwise we might as well just keep all the relatively wealthy white males, because, they have, whether consciously or unconsciously, done an incredibly good job of protecting their collective interests, as the current distribution of power demonstrates. So there's nothing wrong with, identifying that gender is one of many structural determinants. But I think one of perhaps the anxiety that you're getting at here is, if I can put this bluntly, like the trope of the Karen or something like that. Which is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, this idea that white women can sometimes take up space that black women or other racialized women and others would benefit from. So the way out of that is to build these kind of horizontal solidarities. And I'll pass it over to Alex for comment on this one too.
Yeah, I mean, I think AJ has really covered all the points. The only one that I guess I'm grappling with or wrestling with a bit here is the last comment you make here. In this space, I'm increasingly worried about highlighting gender-related issues for fear of it being perceived as racist. And I'm just wondering if you're referring to the fact that some of the colleagues you have that you are trying to grapple with the way they interact, are they racialized men who are doing this? And so you pointing out some patriarchal practice, you're afraid because you're a white person, a white woman, that it's going to be perceived as racist, or that you're calling out, your colleagues in the global South in this particular kind of way. I'm just like your comments very eloquent, but I sense there's something there that I'm just not getting, and I'm curious about it. I will say this, that I think while the trope of the Karen is a problematic one, I think like one thing we don't spend a lot of time talking about here is the way that class dynamics play into this, and we can't dismiss the fact that that there's a class component to this that does influence the way these things play out in practice, and complicates it all. So yeah, I would be concerned about the same kinds of things too. I think one of the big challenges is finding ways in professional environments to broach these conversations without risking your livelihood and your career. You know, I always say, we've talked about this in previous episodes, but you know, we all have to have our line. I'm certainly not suggesting you throw the gauntlet down, say you change or I quit. But you know, there are industries that are kind of awash in these dynamics, and you have to wonder, like, how do you change the way that operates when the whole edifice is built on this house of cards, you know, this kind of assumption that certain kind of people, as AJ so eloquently pointed out, who think and behave essentially the same way, though they might look different or like to engage in like different sexual practice or whatever, that's different, but everything else about them is the same. So I'm just curious about that. I guess it's more of a question, less of a comment. I'm going to leave it at that because we're just about out of time and we've got a few more questions to get to.
All right, yeah, so in the interest of time, let's jump right to the next question. I echo the comments of the individual identifying as white above. I found myself using the wrong language and unintentionally creating an uncomfortable situation. I appreciate your efforts to create a space to have an intelligent, open, and honest talk about racism. I've struggled to differentiate from a difference of opinion in our current Nova Scotia racial unrest and my own unconscious bias. Are there self-checks you'd recommend to help someone tell the difference? Oh, it's a really good question. I think for me anyway, the self-check that informs me the most is, you know, am I feeling defensive? Do I feel like someone's pushed my back against the wall right here, or that I've been exposed? And if I feel any of those things, you know, old AJ, like from 10 years ago or whatever, might have been inclined to push back, to deny, that sort of thing. But one thing that I've learned from organizing with, you know, people at many different intersections of experience is that in those moments, more than any, that's when you need to kind of, you know, shut up and listen. So before you answer, think like, what are the grains of truth? You know, one organization I was involved with called it, I forget the exact term, but they said when you're receiving a criticism, and it should be a structured criticism ideally, but in this case, it's not going to be. But when someone is giving you a criticism, look for the grains of truth in it first. And there are usually always grains of truth. Try and understand where the person's coming from and recognize that where they're coming from is not necessarily what your intent is, but the gap between those two things is a very real thing. And your work in that context is, I think, to acquiesce if it doesn't cause you harm in some ways, so that you can kind of deal with this. And take it away, and so that it becomes not a source of harm anymore for the person. That's in a more like kind of serious, like that's if somebody's calling you out on something, right? But the worst thing that you can do if someone's calling you out is to push back. That's the moment when you listen and you try and understand what they're saying. So that's how I would say I'd recommend telling the difference, and I'll pass it to Alex on that so we can try and get to the last couple of questions.
I mean, the only thing I'd say about this is that I dislike and reject the notion of unconscious bias. This is all about like diversity, equity, inclusion training in the workplace. I like to deal in relations of oppression and exploitation. That's where I live. Like it's the problems we have in society are not because we have accidentally, individually, somehow inculcated, cultivated notions like individual bias and dislike for other specific groups. That's what liberal like nonsense institutions want you to believe. So you can watch a documentary and, you know, like do some guided meditation and work your way out of racism. That's just bullshit. So don't feel bad about, like, you are not personally responsible for white supremacy in the society. You are born into a world that is white supremacist and to which you are responsible, and for which you're responsible for changing too. Like, I would say that much. That involves a very different set of ethics. So yeah, like absolutely. Just, I mean, don't do the thing that that AJ is talking about. Don't be defensive. Super important. Understand that differences of opinion are often worked out in ways that are deeply gendered and racialized and classed. So the ability to use language and to hold space and to like make arguments in certain kinds of fora belong to groups that have been given the privilege and prestige and ability to work those things out. So sometimes even the ways we argue about things reflect our deep privilege and our ability to mobilize resources, which is racially, gendered, and class divided. So try not to use those as weapons. In other words, when somebody is calling you out for something, try to at least hear the grains of truth, as AJ's pointed out. But yeah, don't struggle with unconscious bias. That, I think, that way lies nothing but self-help groups. Back to you, AJ.
All right. So in the interest of time, I see we do have a couple questions, but I'm just going to take one more question, and apologies to those who didn't get your questions in this month. Please do come back next time and post these questions. So the last question I have that we have time to take is, Dalhousie recently posted a position for Assistant Vice Provost, Equity and Inclusion, but specified that the people who apply is, quote, restricted to candidates who self-identify in one or more of the following equity-deserving groups, Indigenous persons and racially visible persons, close quote. I can fully understand the need to create opportunities for underserved groups, but can this approach not also foster an us versus them culture? I worry that this may start to create a definition of diversity that is only based on race or visible diversity and might limit our ability to cultivate more allies. Okay, so thanks for the question. And one thing I would say is I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it yet, to check out some of our past episodes. I think October in particular, we had a very lengthy discussion about work and what it means to work. But just to kind of speak more specifically to your question here, I think it really has to come down to exploring why it is you and others would feel that it is an us versus them. So the way that I understand a position like this is that an institution, a powerful institution, recognizes that they are the ones who are structurally deficient, right? This is something that I've spent a lot of time trying to explain to journalists and stuff who've asked me about this particular hire, and actually. The point that I always like to stress is that, you know, this isn't about creating an opportunity for a racialized person. This is about thinking about how a racialized person or a person with a particular set of experiences can come in and ideally be set up to succeed, not for their personal gain, but in order to dismantle the structural problems that exist in the university. Dalhousie University, I don't think they would mind me telling you this, it's not like, you know, breaking news or anything, has historically been an incredibly racist institution. You know, like Dalhousie, like there's my colleague Afua Cooper and others have presented whole reports on the 200 years of Dalhousie, you know, the slave owning financial privileges that have created this university. And I mean, I could tell you stories about even my own experience as an undergrad student here, you know, less than 20 years ago, that would, you know, anyway, I'm not here to slag on Dalhousie. What I'm here to say is that Dalhousie does have a structural problem with privileging white male perspectives. And to have in order to understand what's happening here, you have to understand the institutional culture. And this is related to the topic that we were talking about previously about international development, senior management more generally. The problem here is not that we are creating positions that are reserved for people with particular lived experiences. In another language, we would call that people who bring certain credentials that a white person does not have to bear. So I prefer to see this as your qualifications. How are you qualified to deliver a senior level of, program on equity and inclusion? And there are lots of different ways that you can explain and justify that, right? But if we don't see this, if we don't see race and lived experience as a legitimate qualification for a high level position like that, then I think we're in real trouble of just replicating the same problems over and over again. And then I had more on that, but I think, I imagine this will be a constant topic for us. So we'll return to this inevitably. What I'm going to do now is pass it over to Alex to give his final comment on this and then to close our session for this month.
Yeah, thanks, AJ, and thanks for your question. I'll be brief because we are right up against our time limit now, but I said it in a previous episode and I'm borrowing it from someone who I can't remember now, an author, basically who said, in a white supremacist society, whiteness is the original affirmative action. So I have a real problem when these kinds of issues are brought up abstractly, and I think white identifying people who are anxious about the future, understandably so, because of the predations of capitalism and the precarity it thrusts us all into, who don't want to see them or their kids or people they love not have opportunities. I get all of that, but think about what you're asking. In a society that for decades and centuries has systematically privileged even the most mediocre, moneyed, especially class privileged white people over absolutely everyone else, the idea that a single position being created that would be directed towards somebody of another visible identity is somehow the thing that's creating polarization, I think is like super problematic. And I would ask people to take a real breath on that one and just reflect on that for a second. In the second instance, I would say this whole idea of creating us versus them, we live in a society that is all about us versus them. You're constantly awash in these narratives. I agree, that doesn't need to be the case. That is the structure of exploitation and oppression woven together so the ruling class can make the most of the rest of us, steal wealth and labor and our lives from us, and then get us to fight each other. So I couldn't agree more, but this is not the fault of limited attempts that try to address, the kind of overwhelming whiteness of being in these institutions. So no, I agree. This is not the answer. This is not how we achieve racial justice or social change, but this is an important initiative that I think opens things up for people from other identities. The last thing I'll say about this is that I'm really uncomfortable, and I'm going to go on the record as saying this at the risk of being provocative. I'm really uncomfortable with this idea that inclusion, in the midst of addressing the issue of white supremacy, that we should be extending this out to all kinds of, shall we say, like invisible identity categories. So I take it the issue here that you might be signaling is that, people with, let's say, learning disabilities or invisible disabilities are not included in this definition, so that you might be a person with autism, for example, living with autism, or have another form of, being, and that's real and true. And absolutely, those groups have also been denied opportunity, but not in the same systematic way as racialized people in white supremacist society. And I'm kind of, I would just ask white people not to do this, like not to look at the struggles of indigenous people, Black people, racialized people today, and then do the thing that we are trained to do by our rulers, which is then to say, oh yeah, well, what about this other issue that is also pumped into my head and now I'm going to play devil's advocate on and throw it out there as a way of proving that even this initiative isn't enough and won't solve the problem. And so the implication being we should do nothing about any of these things. I'm not saying that's what you're saying at all. Your question is much more nuanced than that. But in the interest of just summing things up, that's where I'd say we are, right? If we're not going to start somewhere, then what are we supposed to do? And I think these limited initiatives are just cracking the shell, but they're still important in doing so. Anyway, thank you so much to everyone who's attended today. Thanks to all our team behind the scenes, of course. Thanks to AJ for doing the heavy work of reading questions today and moderating. Folks, we're going to be back. We may take a break for December. I don't know, we haven't had this conversation yet, but we will definitely post when our next session will be, either December or January. We hope you can be back with us. We'll probably have a change in platform and try to make it a little bit more accessible, maybe not using the Teams as a basis for it, but stay tuned. We will post in our usual places. And thanks again for coming and being a part of this journey with us. I'm going to wrap it up there. See ya.